The great victories that I was winning with the pike phalanx was really racking up both my stewardship and my renown, and so my army size was growing really rapidly. It didn't take long for me to get 89 men, which I just filled with pikemen. And so when I encountered enemy parties that appeared to be a lot stronger, I felt pretty damn confident. Even when I was on the attack, I could just march my units up under the cover of a hill or something like that to get close enough, and then just go for it. My job was to distract the archers and take as much of their fire as possible, and since I had tons of armour, and so did my horse, that wasn't such a big deal, while the infantry just got to grips with theirs and began just shredding it. As you can see, there's little opening for their infantry to be able to do anything at all, and because I had separated my phalanx into two companies, I was able to use them quite aggressively. If their infantry backed off to try and make sure they weren't just getting poked to death, I could advance them in order to make the wall of spiky doom come closer to them, very aggressively. And this is actually more historically accurate. In most video games, like Total War games, spears are generally considered to be a defensive weapon, but historically, the Macedonian phalanx was a hugely offensive weapon, and it was designed to simply continue to march forward, stabbing anything in its way. And so that's what I did, and nothing could stand before me. I was so easily able to defeat their infantry regiments, I almost felt kind of bad for them. I mean, what are they supposed to do here, exactly? The constant flurry of attacks from my soldiers, and the constant pressure that I was keeping up on them, just pushed them further and further back, until I had whittled them down to a point where they were simply unable to resist me. After the last of their infantry had broken and run, the only thing left to do was, of course, get into their archers as quickly as possible, which is the most painful part of any of these battles, because by this point a lot of my guys had put their shields away and had used their throwing axes, so were just using their two-handed pikes, and of course they were getting a few arrows in the face. Now, there isn't really a huge amount I could do about this. I would charge in personally, obviously, and try and absorb all the arrows that I could, but the archers aren't actually that stupid, and most of them, frankly, ignored me. But it's not the end of the world, because on this particular battle we were not far away from the archers, and the archers didn't have a good field of fire on my phalanx, so very few actual casualties were caused by this shooting gallery. I defeated Crotor's larger army with only 6 wounded men, 0 men dead, which, had I been one of my pikemen, I would have been very pleased about. So at this point I was getting a bit cocky, and I was thinking, okay, I think I can probably take absolutely massive armies. So I wonder what the biggest army that I can take is with about 89 pikemen. So I besieged Ortysia, and because they had such a large garrison, 400 of them decided to come out and fight me in the open field, which is exactly what I wanted. 400 militia? I think we can take that. There wasn't even a particularly good defensive location either, so we just lined up in our phalanxes on the open ground and waited for them to come. And the horde came on and did something I wasn't expecting, which is to flank us with heavy cavalry. Now, thankfully, everyone had spears, and this didn't do too much as it was crashing through us, although it did discombobulate the line somewhat. However, thankfully, it didn't really have an effect on the discipline of my men, and as you can see from the green kills racking up in the top right corner, everything started going swimmingly. I patrolled the back of our lines to make sure that the cavalry didn't have too much effect on our men, but I didn't have a very good way of countering it, other than being diligent. But already you can see that there's a significant no man's land between my line and theirs. Getting in closer is just too damn dangerous for them, and so they have had to move back and wait for the next move. And the best thing that they could do is try and charge in with their cavalry to break my men up. However, this is very dangerous for their cavalry, and their cavalry basically got cut up doing it. And since I was in control of the battle, I decided, well, it's time for the phalanxes to advance. And again, like the previous battles, whittled them down. So despite being in and of themselves a large fighting force, they had nowhere to go and were not going to get through the barbed wall of pikes. But as you can see, once the enemy units were sufficiently depleted, their rank of archers, and in this case hundreds of them, were able to start firing at the wings of my men. So I told them to advance in order, cutting their way through the last of the enemy infantry, and to move on to the archers. However, I was unhorsed, and since I was unable to properly direct the battle from foot, it was time to just charge. This, of course, was the desperately painful part of the battle, in which I suffered the most casualties. Up until this point, I hadn't lost a man, and now men were dying. But of course, as soon as my pikemen got amongst them, well, that was it really. The enemy archers obviously weren't able to withstand them, and the battle was eventually won. In the end, though, I had lost 16 men. Mostly, almost entirely from the archers, 9 hireling pikemen and 6 elite, which I was not happy about at all. But I was outnumbered 4 to 1, and it's not like the pike phalanx hadn't performed magnificently. Those that survived gained an awful lot of experience, and I took an awful lot of loot. So, from a professional and financial perspective, it was definitely worth it. I decided not to press the siege. That's not what I was here for. I was just here to get a massive battle under my belt, take a lot of loot, and get a lot of experience. And mission accomplished. So I went and sold my ill-gotten gains, and then spent quite a long time going around each city looking for mercenary pikemen. Because of all my successes, the size of my army was exploding. And by the time I had filled it up, I had about 100 pikemen in my phalanx. And then I saw that the Imperial faction that I was at war was at war with another Imperial faction that I wasn't at war with. I had 100 men. They had 653 besieging the city. Go on then, let's give it a go. What's the worst that could happen? Unfortunately, the map didn't have very many defensible places, so I was forced to basically move to this depression right at the back of the map and set my 2 regiments up in a chevron formation, so they would be able to essentially stop the enemy from just pile driving from one flank or the other, while hopefully keeping the main body of their infantry off of me and avoiding incoming fire from their archers. Of course, I'm pretty outnumbered in every single way here, so I wasn't very optimistic. I'd only just got my men arranged before the first of their cavalry came over the brow of the hill and pile drive straight into my lines. Thankfully, though, these are all pikemen, and this didn't go brilliantly for me. The deaths that you can see in the corner are actually an ally that I didn't realise I had. He had a pretty piffling amount of very low-level troops, and they died pretty quickly. As you can see, my pikemen were just cutting him up. However, after that first wave of cavalry, the mass of his army came over the hill. And I have to say, I thought, okay, well, this isn't going to go brilliantly. But my heroic pikemen held the line and started doing the butcher's work. I spent my time desperately trying to kill the elite cavalrymen who'd been unhorsed behind our lines, because the last thing I wanted is for them to start making havoc behind my men. But to be honest with you, these guys are so damn tough. It was really difficult to take them out. It's not even that they were brilliant fighters. I was able to beat them on a one-on-one fight, but they were just really well armoured. As you can see, the tide of them were just too many to hold back. They were overrunning us by simply being so numerous. And I was completely unable to stop the cavalry of theirs from just coming around the back of my line and causing merry havoc. But once their cavalry had been dealt with, it became evident that I had to protect the flanks of my men, because they were in danger of simply being in-rounded and torn apart themselves. After the initial fervour of their attack, the battle ebbed a bit more. My men had held them, and so now they had to try and grind through us. And so our job was the long and thankless task of standing in line and just jabbing with spears. And this went on for quite some time, probably about 2 or 3 solid minutes. And as you can see, my men were doing a superb job. I'd take the odd casualty, but overall, this was going our way. After a long time of this highly defensive play, it was becoming apparent that my lines were getting a bit shortened, leaving my centre actually quite weak and vulnerable. So I went over to help pin it together and try and reshuffle my men, but I'd noticed that actually my men had been very, very effective here and had pushed them back somewhat. So after I helped secure the safety of the line, I realised that I could actually move them back in place, and they'd be able to do that successfully. And so we in fact still held the position, and what I had to do is make sure that my right flank wasn't being overrun purely on weight of numbers. Eventually the horde had been whittled down and beaten back on both the right and left flank, to the point where the left flank could start advancing to meaningfully contact the enemy and start cutting them apart as previously, which of course they did. Despite the numerical superiority of the enemy's force, and the fact that they did have many elite troops, we were winning this. We pushed our advantage, and it was starting to look like the end was in sight. They still had some cavalry, but that was clearly too wise to continue assaulting the Phalanx. And we were just annihilating their men in front of us. Whatever they had left, we were just pushing straight on into it. Finally, standing atop an absolute mountain of corpses, we managed to completely rout and push through the remaining infantry that they had. This had been an absolute massacre. Though I had as well lost many, many good men, we had definitely come out on top, and we still had quite a solid fighting force. And then it became evident that the second half of their army was drawing up over the hill. Hundreds and hundreds of archers. I thought perhaps I could get them to come closer if we moved back into the ranks at the very bottom of the hill, but it wasn't enough. They could still shoot us, and we had only one thing that we could do. Advance the few hundred meters up the hill into this volley fire and try and get to grips with them. It was harrowing watching my exhausted men desperately climbing up this snow-covered hill, only to find ranks upon ranks, 4 or 5 men deep, of well-armed, well-rested archers who were ready to just simply finish the job. And with that, the bane of the Phalanx had won. But we had killed or wounded about 500 men, which was pretty damn impressive, and I was able to simply reload the battle. I decided not to continue pursuing this fight. 600 plus men for 100 pikemen would probably be a lot more possible if half of their army wasn't ranged. And so instead I encountered 200 of their men just idling next to the main army, intercepted them and destroyed them with very little loss. So that's the condition of the Phalanx at the moment. I think what I'm going to do is recruit probably about 30 or 40 men as my army grows, who can be my cavalry, because, as I suppose Alexander discovered, pikes are great, apart from when you have to deal with archers. And in cases like that, I'm going to need something that I can send around and in advance of the men to hold the archers up and distract them and hopefully do as much damage to them as possible. So I will do that, and I will give you a new report next time.